The second rule of categorical syllogisms is this. If a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must also be distributed in a premise. Okay, so let's take a look at an argument. All robots are machines. No birds are robots. No birds are machines. The first thing I'm going to do when evaluating arguments by applying the rules is I'm going to identify all the distributed terms in the argument. First premise is an A statement, and every A statement distributes its subject term. The second premise is an E statement. Every E statement distributes both its subject and predicate terms. And our conclusion is also an E statement, so both its terms are going to be distributed. Now, when we apply the rules, we apply them in order. We start with 1. If the argument adheres to rule number 1, we move on and apply rule number 2 to see if it adheres to that. If at any point the argument doesn't adhere to a rule, we stop. The failure to adhere to even one rule proves the argument invalid. The first rule says that the middle term of the argument has to be distributed at least once. Here the middle term is robots, and it's actually distributed twice. It's distributed in both premises. So this argument adheres to rule number 1, so we move on to rule number 2. And we can see here that the minor term of the argument, the subject of the conclusion statement, is distributed. That means it also has to be distributed in a premise to adhere to rule number 2, and it is distributed here in the second premise. So far everything looks good. The major term, the predicate of the conclusion, is distributed. And it's not distributed up here in the premise. And this tells us this argument does not adhere to rule number 2, and that means the argument is invalid. And the fallacy that proves it invalid is illicit major, because we have the major term distributed in the conclusion, but not in the premise. Had it been the case that our minor term, birds, were distributed in the conclusion, but not in a premise, then we'd have the fallacy of illicit major. Okay? Now notice that we don't have a kind of mirror image of this rule that says, hey, if you have a term that's distributed in a premise, it has to also be distributed in the conclusion. No. What rule number 2 says is if you have a term distributed in a conclusion, that's when it has to also be distributed in a premise. But if a term is distributed in a premise, it does not have to also be then distributed in a conclusion. Okay. All x are y, some x are not z, some z are not y. Okay, first premise is an A statement. Those distribute their subject terms. Second premise is an O statement. Those distribute the predicate terms. And the conclusion is also an O statement. My middle term has to be distributed in order to comply with rule number 1. X is our middle term, and it's distributed in the first premise, so we can check that off. Y is distributed in the conclusion, and rule number 2 says if you have a term that's distributed in the conclusion, it has to also be distributed in a premise. And you can see here that y is not distributed in that first premise, and that tells us, again, invalid, and again, another illicit major. And you can see here a good example of this note here. Z is distributed in a premise, but it's not distributed in the conclusion, and that's perfectly fine. We don't even have to pay attention to that. We're only concerned with, so far, the middle terms and whether or not they're distributed at least once, and the major and minor terms, and making sure that if either is distributed in the conclusion, that it's also distributed in a premise. All right, finally. Some tall guys are friendly guys. All tall guys are athletic guys. Therefore, some athletic guys are friendly guys. Okay, so we mark our distributed terms. We only have one distributed term in this argument because our premise, first premise, and our conclusion statement are both I statements, and I statements don't have any distributed terms. Our second premise is an A statement, and all A statements distribute their subject terms. So now we can start to work through the rules to determine if this argument is valid or invalid. Our middle term is tall guys, and the middle term is distributed here in the second premise. So rule number 1 has been complied with. Rule number 2 says if there's a term distributed in the conclusion, then it has to be distributed in a premise. But we have an I statement as our conclusion, and there's no distributed terms in an I statement. So when this occurs, the rule doesn't apply. This rule number 2 does not apply if there are no terms distributed in the conclusion statement. So we can just blow right past rule number 2 and move on to rule number 3.